It was a peaceful spring morning when the moving trucks pulled up to 42 Pine Street. James Wilson stood at his kitchen window, coffee mug in hand, watching as the new family began unloading their belongings. After 15 years in Cedar Grove, James had grown accustomed to knowing everyone in the neighborhood, and change made him uncomfortable. The Robinson family seemed nice enough at first glance. Mr. Robinson wore a crisp business suit and helped the movers with the larger furniture, while Mrs. Robinson directed traffic and kept an eye on their teenage son, who was carrying boxes labeled "fragile" in bold letters. But something about them made James uneasy. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but he found himself spending more time than usual peering through his blinds. His wife Susan noticed his behavior and often urged him to go introduce himself, but James always had an excuse ready. "They're probably too busy settling in," he'd say, "or maybe next week when things calm down." As days turned into weeks, James developed a routine. Every morning, he'd watch Mr. Robinson leave for work at precisely 7:30 a.m. in his silver SUV. Their son would catch the school bus at 8:15. But Mrs. Robinson's schedule was different. Sometimes she'd leave early in the morning and return late at night. Other times, she wouldn't leave the house for days, only to suddenly disappear for hours on end. James began keeping a mental log of their activities. He noticed cars he didn't recognize parking briefly outside their house late at night. Sometimes Mrs. Robinson would step out for quick conversations with people in these vehicles. Drug deals, James whispered to himself, though he had no evidence to support such claims. The neighbors seemed to welcome the Robinsons warmly. Mrs. Peterson from across the street brought over her famous apple pie, and the Thompson kids quickly befriended the Robinson boy, often playing basketball in their driveway. But James remained skeptical. His suspicions grew when he overheard Mrs. Robinson on the phone one evening while he was trimming his hedges. She spoke in hushed tones, using what seemed like code words. "The package will be delivered at midnight," he heard her say. "Make sure everything's in place." That night, James couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned, his mind racing with possibilities. Susan noticed his distraction during dinner and tried to reason with him. "Honey, they seem like a lovely family," she said, passing him the mashed potatoes. "Why don't we invite them over for dinner this weekend?" But James shook his head. "Something's not right, Susan. I can feel it." His paranoia reached new heights when he spotted Mrs. Robinson meeting with a rough-looking character in the grocery store parking lot. They exchanged what appeared to be documents, and the man quickly disappeared into the crowd. James's hands trembled as he started his car, convinced he had witnessed something sinister. The final straw came during a particularly stormy night. Through the rain-streaked windows, James watched as 3 cars pulled up to the Robinson house within an hour. Each time, Mrs. Robinson would step out briefly, exchange something with the occupants, and hurry back inside. That night, as thunder rolled overhead, James sat at his desktop computer, typing out a detailed email to the local police department. His fingers hesitated over the send button as Susan's words echoed in his mind. "They're just people, James. New neighbors trying to make a home." But his suspicions won out. With a click, the email was sent, and James felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He had done his civic duty, he told himself. If he was wrong, no harm done. But if he was right? Little did James know, his actions would set in motion a chain of events that would shake his world to its core and force him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself. As he climbed into bed that night, feeling satisfied with his decision, he had no idea that his carefully constructed worldview was about to come crashing down around him. The darkness outside his window seemed to hold secrets, but the biggest revelation would come from where he least expected it. And when the truth finally emerged, it would leave him questioning everything he thought he knew about his new neighbors and himself. Looking back, James would later realize that this night marked the beginning of a journey that would change not just his life, but the lives of everyone in Cedar Grove. But for now, he slept soundly, unaware that his world was about to turn upside down. The following weeks turned into a whirlwind of obsession for James. His daily routine now revolved around watching the Robinson family's every move. His morning coffee was no longer a moment of peace, but rather a surveillance session from behind his curtains. Even his wife Susan started noticing how his behavior was changing. "You barely touched your dinner again," Susan mentioned one evening, concern evident in her voice. And you've been so distracted lately. What's going on? James merely shrugged, his eyes fixed on the window. Just keeping an eye on things, he muttered. He had started keeping a detailed journal of the Robinson family's activities. The leather-bound notebook, hidden in his desk drawer, was filling up quickly with times, dates, and observations. Every late-night visitor, every unusual phone call, every suspicious-looking package, it was all documented in his increasingly messy handwriting. 3:15 a.m. Black Sedan parked outside for 7 minutes. 11:45 p.m. Mrs. R met with unknown man in hoodie. 2:30 a.m. Lights on in basement, strange noises. His co-workers at the accounting firm noticed his exhaustion. Dark circles had formed under his eyes from staying up late, watching through his bedroom window. His boss even pulled him aside one day to ask if everything was okay at home. You seem distracted lately, James. Is there something we should talk about? But James brushed off everyone's concerns. In his mind, he was conducting an important investigation. The more he watched, the more convinced he became that something sinister was happening next door. One particularly memorable night, James witnessed what he considered his smoking gun. It was around midnight when a sleek black car pulled up to the Robinson house. Mrs. Robinson emerged from her front door wearing dark clothes and carrying what looked like a duffel bag. The exchange was quick, barely 30 seconds, but James's hands shook as he scribbled down every detail in his notebook. His paranoia reached new heights when he started following Mrs. Robinson during her daytime errands. He'd maintain what he thought was a safe distance, ducking behind shelves at the grocery store, pretending to read newspapers at the local cafe. Once he even followed her to the outskirts of town, where she met with a group of people in an empty parking lot. Susan finally confronted him one Sunday afternoon when she found his notebook. "This has gone too far," she said, waving the journal in front of him. "You're spying on our neighbors. Do you realize how crazy this looks?" James snatched the notebook back. "You don't understand. I've seen things, Susan, strange things. The middle-of-the-night meetings, the coded phone calls, the mysterious packages. They're people, James. Maybe they have different schedules than us. Maybe they have family in different time zones. Have you thought about that?" But James wouldn't listen. He started installing extra security cameras around his house, positioning them to capture the Robinsons' driveway and front door. He bought a powerful zoom lens for his camera and spent hours taking photos of visitors to their house. The turning point came when he overheard Mrs. Robinson on the phone while he was pretending to check his mail. Her words seemed to confirm his worst suspicions. "The operation is almost ready," she said in a low voice. "We'll move everything into position by Friday. The team is standing by." That night, James couldn't sleep at all. His mind raced with possibilities: drug trafficking, money laundering, or worse. He paced his study, reviewing his notes, connecting invisible dots on his mental conspiracy board. By morning, he had convinced himself that he had uncovered something big, something dangerous. His hands trembled as he organized his evidence: photographs, notes, dates, times. Everything he had collected over the past weeks. Susan found him in his study, surrounded by papers and photos. "Please," she begged, "talk to them first. Get to know them before you do anything rash." But James was beyond reasoning. In his mind, he had witnessed enough. The late-night meetings, the suspicious packages, the coded conversations, it all pointed to one conclusion. He was certain the Robinsons were involved in something illegal, and he felt it was his duty to report it. Little did he know that his assumptions were about to lead him down a path that would change everything. As he sat at his computer, preparing to send his evidence to the authorities, he had no idea that he was about to learn a lesson that would shake him to his core. The sun was setting outside his window, casting long shadows across his desk. In those shadows lurked the truth, a truth that would soon emerge and force James to confront his own prejudices and assumptions. But for now, he remained convinced of his righteousness, unaware that his world was about to change forever. The morning James decided to file his official complaint started like any other. He woke up early, his mind already racing with thoughts of the evidence he'd gathered. The weight of his leather notebook felt heavy in his briefcase as he drove to the local police station, his heart pounding with each mile. The police station was quieter than he expected for a Tuesday morning. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as he approached the front desk, where a young officer greeted him with a professional smile. "How can I help you today, sir?" the officer asked, looking up from his computer. James cleared his throat nervously. I need to report suspicious activity in my neighborhood." His voice came out shakier than he intended. The officer nodded and pulled out a form. "Can you tell me what kind of suspicious activity you've observed?" James placed his notebook on the counter and opened it carefully, as if handling precious evidence. "I've been keeping detailed records," he said, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "My neighbors, the Robinsons, they moved in 2 months ago, and I've noticed some very concerning patterns." For the next hour, James meticulously went through his observations. He showed the officer his photographs, described the late-night visitors, recounted the suspicious phone conversations he'd overheard. His words tumbled out faster and faster as he spoke, like a dam breaking. "There are cars coming and going at all hours," he explained, flipping through pages of notes. "Mrs. Robinson meets with strange people in parking lots. They exchange packages. She uses code words on the phone about operations and moving things into position." The officer took notes, his expression neutral. "And how did you obtain this information, Mr. Wilson?" James faltered for a moment. Saying it out loud made him realize how it might sound. "Well, I've been keeping watch from my house, and sometimes I follow. I happen to be in the same places." "So you've been conducting your own surveillance?" the officer asked, raising an eyebrow. "Someone had to." James defended himself. "The pattern is clear. Just look at these photos of the people visiting their house." He spread out several grainy nighttime photographs on the counter. The officer examined them carefully. "Mr. Wilson, are you aware that following people and taking photographs of them without their knowledge could be considered stalking?" James felt his face grow hot. "But I'm reporting a crime. They're obviously involved in something illegal. Why else would they be so secretive?" Just then, another officer approached the desk. He whispered something to the first officer, who nodded and turned back to James. "Mr. Wilson, we'll need to take your statement formally. Could you please follow Officer Chen to the interview room?" The interview room was small and stark, with just a table and 3 chairs. James sat down, suddenly feeling less confident. For 3 hours, he went through his evidence again, this time with 2 officers asking detailed questions about every observation. "And what made you initially suspicious of the Robinsons?" one officer asked. James opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. When he really thought about it, he wasn't sure what to say. The true answer made him uncomfortable. "They just seemed different," he finally mumbled. The officers exchanged glances. "Different how, Mr. Wilson?" James shifted in his chair. "Their schedule, their visitors, their behavior, it's all unusual for our neighborhood." As the questioning continued, James began to feel less like a concerned citizen and more like someone who needed to defend his actions. The officer's questions made him second-guess things he'd been so certain about just hours ago. "Mr. Wilson," one officer said finally, "we'll investigate these claims, but I need to be clear about something. If these allegations prove to be unfounded, there could be serious consequences for filing a false report, not to mention the potential legal issues regarding your surveillance activities." James left the police station feeling drained and uncertain. The confidence he felt that morning had evaporated, replaced by a nagging doubt. As he drove home, he couldn't shake the feeling that he might have made a terrible mistake. That evening, as he sat in his darkened study, he watched the Robinson house through his window one last time. The lights were on, and through the window, he could see the family having dinner together, looking completely normal and ordinary. For the first time, he wondered if he'd let his assumptions and prejudices cloud his judgment. Little did he know, his report had set in motion events that would soon reveal a truth far different from anything he had imagined. As he finally turned away from the window, his phone buzzed with a message that would begin the unraveling of everything he thought he knew about his neighbors and himself. The truth was coming, and it would change everything. But for now, James sat alone in his study, caught between his certainty and his doubt, unaware that his world was about to be turned upside down in ways he never could have predicted. The investigation into the Robinson family took an unexpected turn just 2 days after James filed his report. The quiet neighborhood of Cedar Grove suddenly buzzed with activity as several unmarked police cars pulled up to the station. James watched from his living room window, his heart racing as officials in suits walked briskly into the building. Inside the police station, Detective Thompson sat at his desk, reviewing James's complaint for the third time. His colleague dropped a thick folder on his desk, causing him to look up. "You're not going to believe this," his colleague said, shaking his head. "That Robinson case, it just got interesting." The investigation team discovered something that made them all pause. Mrs. Robinson's irregular hours and mysterious meetings weren't signs of criminal activity. They were part of something much bigger. As they dug deeper, they found that Mrs. Robinson's credentials painted a very different picture from what James had imagined. The phone on Detective Thompson's desk rang. "Sir, we have confirmation from Central Division," the voice on the other end said. "Mrs. Robinson is one of ours. She's leading Operation Nightwatch." The revelation sent shockwaves through the department. Mrs. Robinson wasn't just any police officer, she was one of the most decorated undercover detectives in the state, currently leading a major investigation into a sophisticated crime ring operating across 3 counties. Back in Cedar Grove, James noticed increased police presence in the neighborhood. Unmarked cars would drive by slowly, and men in suits appeared at odd hours. But this time, they weren't there to investigate the Robinsons, they were there to protect their operation. One afternoon, James's doorbell rang. 2 serious-looking detectives stood on his porch, badges in hand. "Mr. Wilson, we need to speak with you about your recent complaint." James felt his stomach drop as he invited them in. His wife Susan brought coffee, her hands trembling slightly as she set down the cups. "Mr. Wilson," the senior detective began, "we need to discuss the nature of your surveillance activities regarding your neighbors." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You've inadvertently interfered with an ongoing police operation." The color drained from James's face as the detective continued explaining. Every late-night meeting he documented, every suspicious phone call he'd overheard. They were all part of a carefully orchestrated police operation. Mrs. Robinson wasn't a criminal, she was the lead investigator working to bring down a major crime syndicate. "Your actions, while well-intentioned, could have compromised months of careful work," the detective explained. "We've had to accelerate certain aspects of the operation because of your report." James sat in stunned silence, his coffee growing cold in front of him. The notebook that had seemed so important now felt like evidence of his own prejudice and paranoia. "But all those meetings, the strange hours," James stammered, "were part of her cover," the detective finished. "Mrs. Robinson has been coordinating with multiple agencies to bring down a major criminal enterprise. The operation was in its final stages when you filed your report." Susan reached over and squeezed her husband's hand as the reality of the situation sank in. All this time, while James had been suspecting the worst, Mrs. Robinson had been working to make their community safer. The detectives explained that while they couldn't share specific details about the operation, they needed James to understand the seriousness of his actions. His amateur surveillance could have put Mrs. Robinson's life at risk and jeopardized months of careful police work. "We're not pressing charges for the unauthorized surveillance," the detective said, "but we need your complete cooperation in maintaining absolute silence about what you've learned today." As the detectives left, James stood at his window one last time, looking at the Robinson house. He saw it with new eyes now. The late-night visitors weren't criminals, they were fellow officers. The coded phone calls weren't about illegal activities, they were about protecting their community. That evening, as James sat in his study, he began to understand the weight of his assumptions. The evidence he gathered wasn't proof of crime, it was proof of his own prejudices. The real crime had been his unwillingness to see his neighbors as anything other than suspicious because they were different. The streetlights flickered on outside, casting long shadows across his lawn. Somewhere in the city, Mrs. Robinson was probably working, putting her life on the line to keep people safe. And he had almost compromised everything because he couldn't see past his own biases. The investigation had revealed a truth, but not the one James had expected to find. As night fell over Cedar Grove, he realized this was just the beginning of a journey that would force him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself and the way he viewed the world around him. The real investigation was only just beginning, not into his neighbors, but into his own heart and mind. And the evidence he would find there would change him forever. The revelation about Mrs. Robinson hit Cedar Grove like a thunderbolt on a clear day. It happened during an emergency neighborhood meeting called by the police department. James sat in the back row of the community center, trying to make himself as small as possible as Detective Thompson addressed the gathered residents. Due to recent events, we can now disclose that one of our most successful undercover operations has been operating in your neighborhood, the detective announced. The room buzzed with whispers and shocked expressions. James watched as Mrs. Robinson walked to the front of the room, no longer in casual clothes but wearing her official police uniform, complete with badges and commendations. She stood tall, professional, commanding respect with her presence alone. For the past 6 months, I've been leading Operation Nightwatch, she explained, her voice clear and confident. Our team has been working to dismantle a major crime ring that's been targeting communities across the state. The room fell silent as she detailed how her team had successfully infiltrated and gathered evidence against a network of criminals who had been preying on vulnerable neighborhoods. The late-night meetings, the coded conversations, the mysterious packages, all had been part of a carefully orchestrated sting operation. James felt each word like a physical blow. He remembered every suspicious glance he'd cast, every accusatory note he'd written in his journal. The weight of his misconceptions pressed down on him like a heavy blanket. Thanks to our operation, Mrs. Robinson continued, we've prevented millions of dollars in potential losses and protected countless families from becoming victims. She paused, looking around the room. However, our operation was nearly compromised due to unauthorized surveillance activities. James sank lower in his chair as several heads turned in his direction. His wife Susan grabbed his hand, squeezing it supportively. After the meeting, people gathered in small groups, discussing the revelations in excited whispers. James overheard snippets of conversations. Can you believe it? A real undercover detective. All this time, she was protecting us. And to think some people were suspicious of them. Mrs. Robinson was surrounded by neighbors offering congratulations and asking questions. James watched from a distance, the full impact of his actions finally hitting him. He had nearly derailed a major police operation because he couldn't see past his own prejudices. Later that evening, as James and Susan walked home, they encountered Mrs. Robinson in their driveway. James felt his face flush with shame, but she approached them with a professional demeanor. Mr. Wilson, she said, I think we need to talk. They invited her in, and Susan made coffee. Sitting in their living room, Mrs. Robinson explained how James's surveillance had affected their operation. We had to accelerate our timeline, she explained. Years of experience in undercover work, and I nearly got compromised because a neighbor couldn't accept that a family like ours might belong in this neighborhood. Her words weren't angry, but they carried weight. James struggled to meet her eyes. I never thought, he began, then stopped. I didn't realize. That's exactly the problem, Mr. Wilson, she said quietly. You didn't think about any explanation except the worst one. Have you asked yourself why? The question hung in the air like smoke. James felt tears pricking at his eyes as years of unconscious bias and prejudice came crashing down around him. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice cracking. I'm so sorry. Mrs. Robinson nodded slowly. Apologies are good, Mr. Wilson, but actions are better. What are you going to do with this learning experience? The question lingered in James's mind long after Mrs. Robinson left. He spent hours that night thinking about his assumptions, his suspicions, his deep-seated prejudices that he'd never acknowledged before. Outside, the neighborhood settled into its nighttime routine. Through his window, James could see the Robinson house, not as a source of suspicion anymore, but as a reminder of his own need to change. The irony wasn't lost on him. While he'd been watching for criminal activity, the real crime had been in his own heart. The crime of prejudice, of judging without cause, of seeing danger where there was only difference. As the night deepened, James realized this revelation wasn't just about Mrs. Robinson or her undercover work. It was about him, about the way he saw the world, and about the person he wanted to be going forward. The truth had indeed come out, but not the truth he expected to find. Instead of exposing his neighbors, the investigation had exposed something far more personal, his own biases and the urgent need to change them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to think and act differently. For now, James sat in his darkened living room, watching the stars appear one by one, each one a reminder that sometimes the most important discoveries are the ones we make about ourselves. Retree. The aftermath of the revelation spread through Cedar Grove like wildfire. The morning after the community meeting, James woke up to find his front yard littered with paper. Printouts of his emails to the police department had somehow leaked and were scattered across his lawn like fallen leaves. The neighborhood that had once been his comfort zone now felt like hostile territory. Walking to get his morning paper, he could feel the stares from behind curtained windows. Mrs. Peterson, who had always waved cheerfully from her garden, now turned her back when he passed by. At work, things weren't much better. Someone had posted copies of his surveillance notes on the break room bulletin board. His co-workers, who used to joke and chat with him during lunch, now found reasons to eat at their desks. The silence in the elevator was deafening. "Just give it time," Susan would say, trying to comfort him. "People will forget." But forgetting wasn't what James wanted anymore. Each uncomfortable moment, each turned back, each whispered conversation that stopped when he entered a room, they all served as reminders of the change he needed to make. The lowest point came during a weekend barbecue next door. The Robinsons had invited the entire neighborhood, everyone except the Wilsons. The sound of laughter and music drifted over the fence as James sat alone in his backyard, the smell of grilled food reminding him of his isolation. That evening, he heard a knock at his door. It was Mr. Thompson, his neighbor of 15 years, holding a plate of food. "Thought you might be hungry," he said gruffly. "Listen, James, we've known each other a long time. What happened to you, man? This isn't the neighbor I used to know." The conversation that followed lasted hours. James found himself opening up about fears he hadn't even acknowledged to himself, prejudices he'd inherited but never questioned, assumptions he'd made without thinking. "I want to make this right," James said finally, "but I don't know how." The next day, James did something he'd never done before. He walked next door and knocked on the Robinsons' door. When Mrs. Robinson answered, still in her police uniform from work, he took a deep breath. "I'd like to apologize to your whole family," he said, "not just with words, but with actions. I want to learn, to change, to do better." The conversation wasn't easy. The Robinsons shared their experiences, the daily challenges they faced, the constant need to prove themselves in a neighborhood that sometimes viewed them with suspicion. James listened, really listened, for the first time. Over the next few weeks, James took concrete steps to make amends. He started by writing a public letter to the community newsletter, acknowledging his actions and their impact. He joined the Neighborhood Watch program, this time working alongside Mrs. Robinson, learning from her expertise rather than suspecting her motives. The change didn't happen overnight. Some neighbors took longer to warm up than others, but slowly things began to shift. James's genuine efforts to learn and grow didn't go unnoticed. One evening, during a community cleanup day, James found himself working side by side with residents who had avoided him just weeks before. As they picked up trash together, conversations started flowing naturally. People began sharing stories, experiences, perspectives he'd never considered before. The turning point came during a neighborhood emergency. A severe storm had caused flooding in several basements, including the Robinsons. Without hesitation, James was there with his pump and tools, working alongside others to help. Mrs. Robinson found him later, soaked and muddy from the cleanup effort. "This," she said, gesturing to the neighbors working together, "this is community. This is what we should have been focusing on all along." The rain continued to fall, but something had shifted in Cedar Grove. The neighborhood that had been divided was slowly coming together, not despite their differences, but because they were finally acknowledging and respecting them. As James walked home that evening, he passed his old observation post by the window. The notebook that had once been filled with suspicious observations now contained something different: notes from community meetings, plans for neighborhood events, ideas for bringing people together. The street lights flickered on, illuminating faces in windows that now offered waves instead of stares. Children played together in front yards, their laughter carrying no trace of the tensions that had once divided their parents. James realized that the real transformation wasn't just in how others saw him, but in how he saw himself and his community. The aftermath of his mistake had become a catalyst for change, not just for him, but for the entire neighborhood. As he reached his front door, he heard Mrs. Robinson calling out to him, "Don't forget the community meeting tomorrow," she said. "We're counting on you to help plan the summer festival." James smiled and nodded. He was no longer watching from the shadows. He was part of something bigger, something better. The journey wasn't over, but at least now he was walking in the right direction. 1 year had passed since the incident that changed Cedar Grove forever. The neighborhood had transformed, and so had James. On this particular summer evening, he stood before a crowd gathered in the community center, his hands slightly shaking as he held his notes. "A year ago, I was a different person," he began, addressing the diverse faces before him. "I stood at my window, watching my neighbors with suspicion instead of walking outside to greet them with kindness." The room was packed for the first annual Cedar Grove Unity celebration. Families from every background sat together, sharing food and stories. The walls were decorated with photos from the year's events, the neighborhood cleanup, the summer festival, the holiday celebrations that now included traditions from every culture in their community. Mrs. Robinson sat in the front row, now the president of their neighborhood association. She nodded encouragingly as James continued his speech. "My mistakes taught me the hardest and most important lesson of my life," he said. "We don't make a community safer by suspecting each other. We make it safer by knowing each other, understanding each other, and standing together." Over the past year, James had become an unexpected advocate for change. He started by sharing his story at local schools, teaching children about the dangers of prejudice and the importance of questioning their assumptions. His honest accounts of his own transformation resonated with people in ways he never expected. The community newsletter, which once carried his confession, now featured his monthly column about building bridges between neighbors. His latest piece about the elderly couple down the street learning to make traditional dishes from their new neighbors had brought tears to many eyes. "Remember the flood last winter?" James continued, looking around the room. "When the waters rose, nobody asked about anybody's background. We were just neighbors helping neighbors. That's who we really are when we strip away our prejudices." The crowd murmured in agreement. That flood had washed away more than just debris. It had cleared the last traces of division in their community. James remembered working alongside people he'd once viewed with suspicion, passing sandbags down a line that connected every house on the street. After his speech, people gathered around the food tables, sharing dishes from various cultures. James watched as his wife Susan exchanged recipes with Mrs. Robinson while their children played together in the corner. The Robinson boy, who a year ago had been the subject of James's suspicious notes, was now teaching other kids how to solve complex math problems. He'd recently won a state competition, and the entire neighborhood had celebrated his success. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down, Mrs. Robinson pulled James aside. "You know," she said, "when all this started, I never thought we'd end up here." James nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "Neither did I. I was so focused on protecting my neighborhood that I couldn't see I was the one hurting it." They stood in comfortable silence, watching as the last few families chatted and laughed together. The community center, once just a building, had become a true gathering place where differences were celebrated rather than feared. As James helped with the cleanup, he found his old notebook tucked away in a box of community memorabilia. The pages that once held suspicious observations now served as a powerful reminder of how far he'd come. Walking home that night, James and Susan took the long way around the neighborhood. They passed houses where they now knew every family's story. The garden where Mrs. Peterson was teaching other neighbors about sustainable growing practices. The basketball court where kids from all backgrounds played together until sunset. "You know what's funny?" Susan said as they reached their house. "You thought you were watching out for trouble, but you were looking in the wrong direction. The real danger was in closing our hearts to our neighbors." James looked at his window, the one he used to watch from, and smiled. "Now when I look out that window, I don't see suspects. I see friends. I see family. I see community." As they settled in for the night, James could hear the distant sounds of children playing, parents calling them home, and the gentle rhythm of neighborhood life. The fear that had once driven him to suspect his neighbors had been replaced by something much stronger, the knowledge that true security comes from connection, not suspicion. The learning hadn't stopped, and James knew it never would. But now he approached each day with openness instead of fear, curiosity instead of suspicion. He had learned that the best way to protect a community wasn't to watch it from behind curtains, but to be an active part of it, helping it grow stronger together. As night fell over Cedar Grove, the stars seemed to shine a little brighter over their united community. The transformation was complete, but the journey continued, one conversation, one connection, one day at a time.